The morning Kestrel Voss heard the first emergency broadcast, she was reorganizing the philosophy section of the Millbrook Public Library, her fingers tracing the worn spines of books that suddenly seemed irrelevant. The radio crackled with static before the announcer's voice broke through, trembling with barely contained panic. Confirmed reports of aggressive attacks across downtown. Citizens are advised to shelter in place immediately. Kestrel pushed her wire-rimmed glasses up her nose and glanced toward the tall windows facing Main Street. The autumn sun painted everything in golden hues, but something felt wrong. The usual stream of morning joggers and dog walkers had vanished. Even the persistent honking from the nearby intersection had fallen silent. She moved closer to the glass and saw her first glimpse of the impossible. A figure lurching down the sidewalk with jerky, unnatural movements, its clothes torn and stained with something dark. 3 blocks away, Theron Blackwood was elbow-deep in the engine of a 1987 Camaro when the screaming started. He wiped his grease-stained hands on his coveralls and stepped out of his auto shop, squinting against the morning light. The screams weren't the usual sounds of city life or even typical emergencies. These were primal, terror-filled shrieks that made his skin crawl. A woman in a blue hospital uniform came running around the corner, her dark hair streaming behind her as she stumbled and looked back in horror. "Hey!" Theron called out, jogging toward her. "What's happening?" The woman stopped, gasping for breath. Her name tag read, A. Chin RN. She looked up at him with wide, dark eyes filled with disbelief. "They're biting people," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "At the hospital. Patients started attacking the staff. They're not acting human anymore." Azara Chin had worked in emergency medicine for 8 years, but nothing had prepared her for what she'd witnessed in the past hour. Patients she'd treated for minor injuries suddenly turning violent, their eyes vacant yet somehow hungry. She'd seen a man with a broken arm bite a security guard's throat with such ferocity that blood sprayed across the white walls like abstract art. The guard had risen minutes later, moving with that same horrifying, purposeless hunger. Across town, Vigo Nakamura was dismissing his third-grade class early when Principal Morrison's voice echoed through the intercom system with instructions that made no sense. "All teachers report to the main office immediately. Students are to remain in classrooms until further notice." The children sensed something wrong in the adults' sudden tension, their usual chatter dissolving into nervous whispers. Vigo had always prided himself on staying calm under pressure, a skill developed through years of managing energetic 8-year-olds. But as he walked down the hallway toward the office, he noticed something unsettling through the windows facing the parking lot. Parents who had come to collect their children weren't acting right. They moved with strange, stilted gaits, and several appeared to be injured but seemed unaware of their wounds. In the small bakery on Elm Street, Lydia Corvin was pulling fresh sourdough from the oven when her neighbor burst through the front door without ringing the bell that usually announced customers. Lydia had known Marcus for 20 years, watched him grow from a gangly teenager into a reliable postal worker. But the man standing in her doorway bore only a passing resemblance to her friend. His uniform was shredded, revealing bite marks that should have been bleeding heavily but instead showed dark, clotted edges. His eyes held no recognition, no humanity. "Marcus?" she whispered, her arthritis-gnarled hands still holding the hot bread. "Are you hurt?" He responded by lunging forward with a guttural moan, knocking over a display of muffins. Lydia's baker's instincts kicked in as she swung the heavy wooden cutting board, connecting with his skull with a sickening thud. Marcus crumpled to the checkered floor, finally still. Caspian Reed was skipping his last class when he saw his first zombie. The 17-year-old had been planning to spend the afternoon at the arcade, but the abandoned streets made him reconsider. He ducked behind a parked car as a group of shambling figures emerged from the subway entrance, their movements synchronized in their awkwardness. Some still wore business suits or jogging clothes, but all shared the same blank, predatory expression. As reports flooded emergency channels and cell towers began failing, these 6 strangers found themselves facing an impossible reality. The dead were walking, the familiar world was collapsing, and survival depended on abandoning everything they thought they knew about civilization. None of them realized that by sunset they would meet each other, and by the end of the week, they would become something they never imagined possible: warriors in humanity's final stand. By noon, the emergency broadcast had devolved into automated loops repeating the same useless advice. Stay indoors, avoid contact with infected individuals, wait for government assistance. Kestrel had barricaded herself in the library's reference section, using heavy oak tables to block the entrances. She'd always found comfort in books, but now she desperately wished for practical manuals on combat instead of theoretical philosophy. The silence outside felt oppressive until it was broken by frantic pounding on the library's side door. Through the reinforced glass, she could see a tall man in mechanic's coveralls and a woman in scrubs supporting an older woman between them. Behind them, 3 figures moved with that same terrifying jerky gait she'd observed earlier. "Please," the man shouted, his voice muffled by the glass. "We need shelter." Kestrel's rational mind warred with her compassion. Opening the door meant risking her safety, but leaving these people outside meant condemning them to death. She made her choice, moving the tables aside just enough to allow them entry before quickly resealing the barrier. Theron immediately began reinforcing their makeshift barricade with additional furniture while Azara helped the elderly woman to a chair. Lydia Corvin looked shaken but determined, her silver hair disheveled and her apron stained with flour and something darker. "I had to kill my neighbor," Lydia said quietly, staring at her hands. "Marcus. I've known him since he was in diapers. He came into my shop and he wasn't Marcus anymore." Azara knelt beside her, checking for injuries with professional efficiency. "You did what you had to do. Whatever's happening to people once they change, they're not the same person." "The bites," Theron said, testing the stability of their barricade. "It spreads through bites, doesn't it? Like rabies but faster." Kestrel nodded, her librarian's mind already cataloging the information they'd gathered. "I've been monitoring radio frequencies. Military channels are reporting complete communication breakdown in major cities. Whatever this is, it's spreading faster than anyone can contain it." Through the library's windows, they watched their town transform. Cars sat abandoned in intersections, their doors flung open as if their occupants had fled suddenly. Smoke rose from several buildings where fires burned unchecked. Most disturbing were the growing groups of infected wandering the streets, drawn by some instinct toward any sound or movement. Vigo arrived at sunset, leading a small group that included Caspian Reed and 2 other survivors he'd collected along the way. The teacher had managed to evacuate his students safely before the school was overrun, but the effort had cost him. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually neat appearance was disheveled. "The children," he said when Azara offered him water. "I got them to the emergency shelter at the elementary school, but I don't know how long it will hold." There were so many of those things gathering outside. Caspian slumped against a bookshelf, his teenage bravado replaced by exhausted fear. "My mom was supposed to pick me up from school," he said. "I waited for 2 hours before I realized she wasn't coming. I don't even know if she's alive." The group that had formed by chance now faced their first night together. Lydia, despite her own trauma, took charge of rationing the snacks and bottled water from the library's staff room. Her nurturing instincts provided an anchor of normalcy in their upended world. "We can't stay here indefinitely," Theron observed, studying the building's layout. "This place isn't designed to be a fortress. Too many entrances, too much glass." Kestrel had been thinking the same thing. "There's a sporting goods store 6 blocks from here. If we could reach it, we'd have access to camping equipment, maybe some weapons." "That's assuming it hasn't been looted already," Vigo pointed out. "And 6 blocks might as well be 6 miles with those things roaming around." Azara had been quiet, processing everything through her medical training. "We need to understand what we're dealing with. The infected don't seem to feel pain and they don't tire. But they're drawn to sound and movement. If we're smart about it, we might be able to use that against them." As darkness fell, they took turns keeping watch while others tried to rest among the stacks. The infected gathered outside seemed less active at night, but their presence was constant. Occasional moans and the scraping of feet against concrete served as grim reminders of their situation. Caspian found himself paired with Kestrel for the midnight watch. "Do you think help is coming?" he asked quietly. "Like real help from the government or military?" Kestrel looked at the teenager, seeing her own fear reflected in his young face. "I think we are the help," she said finally. "Whatever's coming next, we're going to have to face it ourselves." By morning, their small group had made a crucial decision. They would venture out together not just to find supplies, but to search for other survivors. The world they'd known was gone, but perhaps they could build something new from the ashes. None of them realized that their first tentative steps toward cooperation would eventually transform them into something their previous lives never could have produced. A family forged in crisis, bound by necessity and strengthened by shared purpose. The war for humanity's survival was about to begin in earnest. The first rule of surviving the dead, Theron discovered, was that everything you thought you knew about violence was wrong. Movies and video games had taught them that headshots were instant kills, but reality proved messier and more terrifying. When their group encountered their first small pack of infected while scavenging the sporting goods store, Vigo's swing with a baseball bat connected perfectly with a zombie's skull, only to have the creature stumble but continue advancing with bone fragments protruding from its forehead. "They don't stop," Caspian yelled, backing against a display of camping gear as a woman in a torn wedding dress lurched toward him. Her bouquet was still clutched in one decomposing hand, the white roses now stained brown with dried blood. Azara had armed herself with a crowbar from Theron's shop, and her medical knowledge proved unexpectedly useful. "Sever the spine," she called out, demonstrating by driving the curved end into the base of an infected man's neck. "Or massive brain trauma. Nothing else works." Kestrel surprised everyone, including herself, by showing a natural aptitude for combat strategy. While the others focused on individual threats, she observed patterns in the infected's behavior. "They're attracted to the brightest light," she noted, watching how the zombies oriented toward the store's emergency lighting. "And sudden movements get their attention more than steady ones." Lydia, despite her age, proved remarkably adaptive. She'd selected a heavy cast-iron skillet from the sporting goods store's camping section, and her years of kneading bread had given her stronger arms than anyone expected. "It's just like tenderizing meat," she said matter-of-factly after crushing an infected child's skull, though her hands shook for an hour afterward. Their first real victory came 3 days later when they successfully cleared the town's small police station. The building had been overrun, but most of the infected were trapped inside when someone had triggered the security lockdown. Theron managed to override the system, and they methodically eliminated the dozen zombies one by one, learning crucial lessons about timing, positioning, and the importance of escape routes. "We're getting better at this," Vigo observed as they inventoried their haul. 4 handguns, 2 shotguns, limited ammunition, and riot gear that would prove invaluable in close combat. "But we're also getting colder about it." It was true. Each day of survival required them to shed more of their former selves. Caspian no longer flinched when he had to put down infected children his own age. Azara stopped seeing patients when she looked at the zombies, viewing them instead as problems to be solved with targeted violence. Kestrel's analytical mind began treating human beings as statistical data points in survival equations. The transformation was most evident during their rescue of Father Miguel from the town's small Catholic church. The elderly priest had barricaded himself in the bell tower for nearly a week, surviving on communion wine and crackers while dozens of infected filled the sanctuary below. When the group arrived, they found him praying over the zombies rather than fighting them. "They were my parishioners," he explained as Theron and Caspian systematically cleared the church. "Mrs. Patterson sang in the choir for 40 years. Tommy Rodriguez was an altar boy." "They're not your parishioners anymore," Kestrel said, not unkindly but with a firmness that surprised everyone. "They're threats to our survival. The sooner you accept that, the better your chances of staying alive." Father Miguel joined their group but struggled with the moral implications of their new reality. His presence forced them to confront their own changing ethics. When they discovered a group of survivors trapped in the high school gymnasium, surrounded by nearly 100 infected, the priest argued for attempting a rescue despite the enormous risk. "We can't save everyone," Azara said during their heated discussion. "Sometimes survival means making hard choices." "Then what separates us from them?" the priest challenged, gesturing toward the wandering zombies. "If we abandon our humanity to survive, what's the point of surviving at all?" The question haunted them, but it was Lydia who provided the answer through action rather than words. She spent hours teaching Caspian to read, sharing stories from her decades of experience, and maintaining small rituals that preserved their connection to civilization. "We survive so we can rebuild," she told the priest. "But we remember who we were so we know what to rebuild toward." Their growing competence attracted other survivors. Dr. Sarah Wyndham, a veterinarian who proved surprisingly skilled at treating human injuries in the absence of proper medical facilities. Marcus Holloway, a former Marine whose tactical knowledge complemented Kestrel's strategic thinking. Elena Vasquez, a communications technician who restored their contact with other survivor groups scattered across the region. By the end of their first month, their initial group of 6 had grown to nearly 20, and they'd established a defensible position in the town's old fire station. They'd learned to move silently through zombie-infested areas, to coordinate attacks with military precision, and to make the brutal calculations necessary for group survival. But their greatest lesson came when they discovered that some survivors were more dangerous than the infected. A group of raiders attempted to steal their supplies and kidnap their women, forcing the survivors to confront the reality that the zombie apocalypse had freed humanity's darkest impulses alongside its best. "We're not just fighting the dead," Vigo realized after they'd driven off the raiders. We're fighting for the idea that civilization is worth preserving. The ordinary citizens of Millbrook were becoming warriors, but they were also becoming something more important, the guardians of humanity's future. Winter's first snow fell like ash over their growing settlement, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and beautiful. Kestrel stood atop the fire station's watchtower, her breath misting in the frigid air as she surveyed their domain. What had begun as a desperate shelter for 6 frightened people had evolved into a fortified community of 43 souls, each one a small victory against the darkness that had consumed the world. The transformation hadn't been easy. Theron had proven to be a master at defensive engineering, directing the construction of a double perimeter fence topped with razor wire salvaged from the county jail. Solar panels retrieved from abandoned houses powered their essential systems, while a series of mirrors and reflectors created blind spots that confused the infected. Most ingeniously, he'd rigged a series of noisemakers throughout the outer perimeter that could be activated remotely to draw zombie herds away from their walls. The beauty of it, he explained to newcomers during orientation, is that they're predictable. They respond to stimuli the same way every time. Once you understand that, they become less monster and more mechanical problem. Azara had established what she called the medical quarter in the station's former equipment bay. Her veterinary colleague, Dr. Wyndham, had proven invaluable in setting up surgical facilities and organizing their medicine supplies. Together, they developed protocols for treating everything from infected bites to winter frostbite. More importantly, they'd created psychological support systems for survivors struggling with the mental toll of their new reality. The living need more care than the dead, Azara observed while treating a young mother whose infant had died from a fever they couldn't treat. Physical wounds heal. Psychological ones can destroy a person just as surely as any zombie bite. Vigo had taken charge of education and intelligence gathering. His experience managing children proved invaluable in organizing the adults, while his natural curiosity led him to establish contact with other survivor communities through Elena's radio network. The reports they received painted a grim picture. Major cities had been completely overrun, military resistance had collapsed in most regions, and the federal government existed in name only. We're essentially living in a feudal system now, he reported during one of their evening council meetings. Small communities led by whoever's strong enough or smart enough to keep people alive. Some are democratic, some are dictatorships, some are barely controlled chaos. Caspian had become their youngest squad leader, commanding a group of teenage survivors with a natural authority that surprised everyone, including himself. His unit specialized in rapid reconnaissance and stealth operations, skills that proved crucial when larger zombie herds threatened their perimeter. The boy who had once skipped school to play video games now carried the responsibility of protecting lives. The trick isn't being fearless, he told his squad before a particularly dangerous supply run. It's being scared but doing what needs to be done anyway. Fear keeps you alive. Panic gets you killed. Lydia had evolved into what Father Miguel called the community's heart. Her daily bread baking had become a ritual that provided comfort and normalcy, while her informal counseling sessions helped people process their losses. She'd also taken charge of preserving pre-apocalypse knowledge, organizing teams to salvage books, DVDs, and digital storage devices from abandoned buildings. Someday, she told anyone who would listen, this will end. When it does, we'll need to remember how to be human again. That knowledge is as important as any weapon. The community's first major test came when a massive herd of nearly 500 infected descended on their position during a February blizzard. The zombies, driven by some unknown instinct, had amalgamated from several smaller groups and moved with terrifying purpose toward their walls. Marcus Holloway, the former Marine, coordinated their defense with military precision. We don't fight them head-on, he announced during the emergency briefing. We channel them, tire them out, and eliminate them systematically. Theron's noisemaker system proved its worth, drawing portions of the herd into kill zones where concentrated fire could eliminate large numbers safely. Caspian's squad used hit-and-run tactics to break up the main group, while Azara's medical team stood ready to treat injuries. Even Father Miguel contributed, using his knowledge of the town's geography to identify choke points where small numbers could hold off larger forces. The battle lasted 18 hours, but when it ended, their community had not only survived but proven something crucial. Ordinary people working together with purpose and planning could defeat seemingly overwhelming odds. We're not just survivors anymore, Kestrel announced to the gathered community as they cleared the last bodies from their perimeter. We're citizens of something new. Something better than what came before. The victory attracted attention from other survivor groups. some seeking alliance and others seeking conquest. Trade relationships developed with communities as far as 100 miles away, creating a loose network of mutual support and shared resources. But it also drew the attention of larger, more dangerous groups who viewed their success as a threat to their own ambitions. Dr. Elena Vasquez's intelligence network brought disturbing reports of a group calling itself the New Republic, led by a charismatic former National Guard colonel who'd carved out a territory encompassing 3 counties. Their forces were well-armed, disciplined, and reportedly enslaved smaller communities under the guise of protection. "They'll come for us eventually," Marcus warned during a council meeting. "Our success makes us a target. We need to decide whether we're going to submit, flee, or fight." The debate that followed revealed how much they'd all changed. The librarian, the mechanic, the nurse, the teacher, the baker, and the teenager had become strategists, warriors, and leaders. More importantly, they'd become family, bound not by blood but by shared struggle and mutual dependence. "We fight," Vigo said finally, speaking for them all. "We've built something worth defending here. We've proved that civilization doesn't have to die with the old world." As spring approached, they prepared for war, knowing that their greatest battle wouldn't be against the mindless dead, but against the living who'd chosen to embrace darkness. The ordinary citizens of Millbrook were about to face their ultimate test. The attack came at dawn on the first warm day of April, when the morning mist still clung to the valley and the early sun painted the zombie-cleared fields in shades of gold. Kestrel was reviewing supply inventories in the communications center when Elena's radio crackled with urgent transmissions from their outer observation posts. "Convoy approaching from the east," came Caspian's voice, tight with tension. "Military vehicles at least 30. Armed personnel. They're flying the New Republic flag." Through her binoculars, Kestrel could see the approaching force. Armored trucks, improvised gun emplacements, and approximately 200 soldiers in mixed military gear. Leading them was a black Humvee flying a banner she'd seen in Elena's intelligence reports. 3 stars on a red field, the symbol of Colonel Harrison Briggs and his New Republic. The convoy stopped just outside effective rifle range, and a single figure emerged from the lead vehicle carrying a white flag. Even at distance, Kestrel could see the man's military bearing, the crisp uniform, and the confident stride of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Citizens of Millbrook," the man's amplified voice carried across the field through a bullhorn. "I am Colonel Harrison Briggs, Provisional Governor of the Eastern Territory under the authority of the New Republic. You have 48 hours to surrender your weapons and submit to lawful authority. Resistance will be met with appropriate force." Theron joined Kestrel on the watchtower, his face grim as he assessed their situation. 200 trained soldiers with heavy weapons against our 43 civilians with hunting rifles and improvised defenses. The math isn't good. But Marcus Holloway, studying the enemy positions through a scope, noticed something significant. They're positioning for a siege, not an assault. They want to starve us out, not storm the walls. That tells me they respect our defenses more than they're letting on. The next 2 days passed in tense preparation. Azara worked with Dr. Wyndham to set up emergency medical stations throughout their compound, while Vigo coordinated the evacuation of non-combatants to the station's reinforced basement levels. Lydia organized the rationing of their food stores, calculating how long they could hold out under siege conditions. 6 weeks if we're careful, she reported to the council. Maybe 8 if we cut rations to subsistence levels. Caspian's reconnaissance teams brought back intelligence about the New Republic forces. They're confident, he reported, almost casual about the whole thing. They've done this before and they expect us to fold quickly. Father Miguel spent his time moving between defenders, offering comfort and last rites to those who requested them. I've been thinking about your question, he told Azara during one of his rounds. About what separates us from them. I think I have an answer now. What's that? Choice, the priest said simply. We chose to protect something. They chose to take it. That choice defines everything that follows. The siege began in earnest on the 3rd day when the New Republic cut off their access to the surrounding area and began systematic psychological warfare. Loudspeakers broadcast surrender demands mixed with propaganda about the safety and prosperity available to those who joined their organization. More disturbing were the reports from other communities that had fallen to Briggs' forces, mass executions of leaders, forced labor camps, and the systematic stripping of resources. He's not building a new society, Elena observed after intercepting New Republic communications. He's building a slave state with himself as emperor. On the 5th day, Vigo made a discovery that changed everything. While searching through the town's historical society records for information about the building's structure, He found plans for a network of maintenance tunnels that connected the fire station to the municipal building, the library, and several other key locations. These were built during the Cold War, he explained excitedly to the council. Part of a civil defense network that was supposed to protect government functions during nuclear attack. Most people forgot they existed. Theron immediately grasped the implications. We could move our people through the tunnels, set up ambush positions, maybe even reach their supply depot. The plan that emerged was audacious and desperate in equal measure. A small team would use the tunnels to reach the New Republic's rear positions while the main force created a distraction at the front gates. If successful, they could capture weapons and vehicles while throwing the enemy into confusion. If it failed, everyone involved would likely die. I should lead the tunnel team, Caspian volunteered. My people know stealth and we're small enough to move quickly through narrow spaces. Absolutely not, Azara protested. You're 17 years old. This is a suicide mission. I'm 17 years old and I've killed more zombies than most of their soldiers, Caspian replied with quiet intensity. Age doesn't matter anymore. Capability does. Kestrel found herself making the same kinds of brutal calculations she'd learned to accept over the past months. Caspian was right. His team had the best chance of success. Sentimentality could doom them all. 6 volunteers maximum, she decided. In and out within 2 hours. If you're not back by then, we assume you're dead and proceed accordingly. The night before the operation, their small community gathered for what might be their last evening together. Lydia had used precious ingredients to bake fresh bread, while Elena's radio picked up distant music from a surviving station somewhere in Canada. For a few hours, they almost forgot they were preparing for war. Whatever happens tomorrow, Vigo addressed the group, we've proved something important. We've shown that ordinary people can choose to be extraordinary. That civilization is worth fighting for. That hope is stronger than fear. As dawn approached, Kestrel stood watch one final time over the community they'd built from nothing. In 6 months, a group of strangers had become family, cowards had become heroes, and the desperate had become defenders of humanity's future. The battle for Millbrook was about to begin, and with it, the test of everything they'd learned about courage, sacrifice, and the price of freedom. The tunnels smelled of decades-old concrete and stagnant water, but to Caspian they represented hope threading through darkness. His team of 6 moved through the narrow maintenance corridors like shadows, their footsteps muffled by strips of cloth torn from civilian clothes. Above them, the sound of the New Republic siege engines rumbled through layers of earth and stone. Movement ahead, whispered Naya Petrov, a 19-year-old former college student who'd proven to have an almost supernatural ability to navigate in complete darkness. She held up her fist, freezing the entire team as voices echoed from a ventilation grate above their heads. Through the metal slats, they could see New Republic soldiers moving supplies in what had once been the town's municipal garage. Caspian counted at least 20 men, but more importantly he spotted their target, a communications truck that would give Elena access to the enemy's entire radio network. Remember, he breathed to his team, we're not trying to win a battle. We're trying to buy time and create chaos. Fast, dirty, and gone. The attack began precisely at sunrise when Theron's improvised mortars began lobbing homemade explosives at the New Republic's front positions. The diversionary assault was deliberately noisy and visible, drawing attention away from the tunnel team's emergence behind enemy lines. Caspian's group struck with coordinated precision that would have impressed their former gym teachers. In 90 seconds, they'd eliminated the guards, seized the communications truck, and begun transmitting false orders that sent entire units racing toward imaginary threats on the opposite side of town. But victory came with a price that none of them had anticipated. As they prepared to withdraw through the tunnels, Naya spotted something that made her blood freeze. A school bus filled with children, surrounded by armed guards. Through Elena's intercepted communications, they learned the horrific truth. The New Republic had been collecting children from conquered communities, planning to relocate them to education facilities, where they would be raised as loyal citizens of the new order. We have to abort, Marcus's voice crackled through their radio from the fire station. New Republic forces are pulling back from our position. You've got maybe 10 minutes before they realize what happened. Caspian stared at the bus, knowing that walking away meant condemning dozens of children to a fate worse than death. But attempting a rescue would likely doom his own team and possibly their entire community. Negative, he transmitted back. We're going to be late. What followed was perhaps the most desperate and heroic 20 minutes in Millbrook's history. Caspian's team, supported by covering fire from Vigo's people who'd taken positions in the library, fought through superior numbers to reach the imprisoned children. In the process, they learned something crucial about their enemies. The New Republic soldiers weren't monsters, just people who'd made different choices about survival. "Please," one wounded soldier gasped as Azara treated his injuries after the fighting ended. "I joined them because they promised safety for my family. We're not all believers." The rescue succeeded, but at devastating cost. Naya fell to sniper fire while herding children towards safety. Tommy Chin, Azara's nephew who'd arrived with a refugee group the previous month, died holding a defensive position so others could escape. Most heartbreakingly, Father Miguel was mortally wounded while shielding a group of 7-year-olds from an explosion. "Did we save them?" the priest whispered as Azara knelt beside him in the tunnel, his blood seeping into the ancient concrete. "The children, did we get them all?" "We got them," she assured him, tears streaming down her face. 43 children safe because of you. Then it was worth it, he smiled, his eyes focusing on something beyond the tunnel walls. "Tell the others, tell them choice matters. Always choose to protect." His words faded with his breathing, leaving Azara holding the body of a man who'd found his purpose in the worst of times. The New Republic forces withdrew that afternoon, their command structure disrupted by false orders and their morale shattered by unexpected resistance. Colonel Briggs himself had been captured during the confusion, his own men surrendering him when they realized they'd been fighting to enslave children. "You don't understand," the colonel protested as Kestrel interrogated him in what had once been the library's children's section. "Civilization is dead. Democracy is a luxury for times of peace. Order requires strength, and strength requires hierarchy." "You're right about one thing," Kestrel replied, looking out at their community as people worked together to tend wounded, comfort refugees, and rebuild damaged defenses. I don't understand how survival became an excuse for surrendering everything that makes us human." The victory brought unexpected consequences. Word of Millbrook's successful resistance spread through Elena's radio network, inspiring other communities to stand against the New Republic and similar authoritarian groups. But it also attracted new refugees, including dozens of the liberated children who had nowhere else to go. "We're going to have to expand," Lydia observed, watching 8-year-old Marcus Holloway Jr., named for the Marine who died defending his evacuation route, play with building blocks in the station's common area. "We've gone from protecting our own to protecting the future itself." Theron had already begun planning extensions to their defensive perimeter, while Vigo organized schools for the children and adult education programs for refugees who'd lost years to survival mode. Azara established mental health protocols for people traumatized by the war, and Elena worked to coordinate mutual defense pacts with other free communities. But it was Caspian who perhaps understood best what they'd actually accomplished. The teenager who'd once thought only about video games now found himself responsible for training other young people in the arts of war and peace alike. "We didn't just fight off the New Republic," he told the newest group of refugees during orientation. "We proved that democracy can survive even when everything else falls apart. We showed that ordinary people can choose to be extraordinary when the stakes are high enough." As winter approached again, their community had grown to over 100 people, with satellite settlements being established in neighboring towns. The zombie threat remained, but it no longer seemed insurmountable compared to the human challenges they'd overcome. Standing in the cemetery they'd established for their fallen, Kestrel reflected on how much had changed since that first emergency broadcast. They'd lost friends, innocence, and any illusions about the ease of survival. But they'd gained something more valuable: proof that civilization was more than governments and institutions. It was the choice to protect rather than exploit, to build rather than destroy, to hope rather than despair. The war for humanity's future was far from over, but the warriors of Millbrook had established something precious in the midst of chaos, a beacon of light in the darkness, growing stronger with each day. 5 years after the world ended, Kestrel Voss stood before a classroom of 23 children in what had once been Millbrook's elementary school. The building had been rebuilt and expanded, its walls now bearing murals painted by survivors who'd found art again after losing everything else. Outside the windows, the town bustled with activity that would have seemed impossible during those first desperate months. "Today we're going to talk about the time before," she told her students, many of whom had been born in the settlement and knew the old world only through stories. "About democracy and choice and why we do things the way we do them here." Among her students sat Elena Martinez Nakamura, daughter of the communications specialist who'd become the settlement's first elected mayor, and Marcus Chin Holloway, adopted son of the nurse who'd expanded their medical facilities into a regional trauma center. Their presence represented something profound: the first generation born into hope rather than despair. The zombie threat hadn't disappeared entirely. Small herds still wandered the reclaimed territories, and isolated outbreaks occasionally required military response. But humanity had adapted with remarkable resilience. The surviving communities had developed protocols, technologies, and social structures that turned the undead from an existential threat into a manageable problem. The most important thing to understand, Kestrel continued, is that your parents and grandparents chose to become heroes. They weren't born special. They were librarians and mechanics and teachers who decided that something was worth fighting for. Through the classroom windows she could see evidence of that choice everywhere. Theron Blackwood, now 53 and gray-bearded, supervised the construction of a new manufacturing facility that would produce solar panels for the entire Northeast region. His apprentices included former New Republic soldiers who defected after seeing what freedom actually looked like. Azara Chin had established the Millbrook Medical College, training doctors and nurses for dozens of Allied settlements. Her students learned not just medicine but ethics, the principles that separated healing from exploitation. The college's motto, suggested by Father Miguel's successor, read simply, "Choice Matters." Vigo Nakamura served as the settlement's ambassador to the growing confederation of free communities that stretched from Nova Scotia to Virginia. His diplomatic work had prevented 3 wars and established trade relationships that were rebuilding industrial civilization piece by piece. Lydia Corvin, now 78 but still baking bread every morning, ran the settlement's historical preservation project. Her archives contain not just records of their struggle, but music, literature, and art salvaged from the dead world. "We're not just rebuilding," she often said. "We're rebuilding better." But it was Caspian Reed who perhaps embodied their greatest achievement. The boy who'd led desperate raids through zombie-infested tunnels had grown into a man who commanded the Free Communities Defense Force, not through authority imposed from above, but through trust earned in the field. His soldiers were volunteers who served fixed terms and could be recalled by their home communities if they forgot their purpose. "The difference between us and the New Republic," he'd explained to a gathering of Allied leaders, "is that our people choose to follow. Theirs had no choice at all." The memorial garden held 37 graves, each representing someone who died defending the principle that ordinary people could choose to be extraordinary. Father Miguel's headstone bore the inscription he'd requested, "He chose to protect." Naya Petrov's marker read, "She chose courage." Tommy Chen's simple stone said, "He chose sacrifice." But the living memorial was more impressive than any graveyard. The settlement now housed over 3,000 people, with satellite communities spreading their model throughout the region. Democracy had not only survived the apocalypse, it had evolved, becoming more participatory and responsive than the old world systems. "The thing about zombies," Dr. Sarah Wyndham explained to her veterinary students during a field exercise, "is that they taught us something important about humanity. We learned that what makes us human isn't our intelligence or our technology. It's our capacity to choose cooperation over competition, protection over exploitation." As evening approached, Kestrel walked through the settlement's central square, past the monument to their fallen and toward the community center where tonight's town meeting would address the question of establishing a university. The debates would be vigorous. Resources were still limited, and some argued that practical training took priority over theoretical education. But that was the point. They argued, they voted, they chose their path together. Democracy was messy and inefficient and sometimes frustrating. It was also the only system that acknowledged the essential dignity of human choice. Elena's evening radio broadcast reached settlements from Maine to the Florida Keys, sharing news, coordinating aid, and maintaining the connections that held their scattered civilization together. Tonight she would report on the successful harvest, the opening of 3 new schools, and the birth of 12 babies in Allied communities. "This is Free Radio Millbrook," her familiar voice carried across the airwaves, broadcasting from the town that proved ordinary people can do extraordinary things. "The weather is clear, the children are safe, and democracy is alive and growing. Until tomorrow, this is Elena Vasquez reminding you that hope is contagious. Keep spreading it." As the stars emerged over the settlement, families gathered for evening meals, students studied by solar-powered lights, and guard patrols walked perimeters that protected not just lives but principles. The zombies still moaned in the distant darkness, but they no longer seemed like harbingers of humanity's end. They were simply another challenge to be met by people who'd chosen to meet it together. Kestrel found herself, as she often did these days, thinking about the children they'd saved and the children they were raising. In their laughter and questions and boundless energy, she saw the future taking shape. A future where the mistakes of the old world need not be repeated, where democracy was more than a word but a lived experience, where ordinary citizens understood that their choices shaped history. The apocalypse had ended not with humanity's extinction, but with its rebirth. And in the light that remained, in the schools and hospitals and democratic assemblies they'd built from the ashes, the warriors of Millbrook had won their greatest victory. They had chosen hope. And hope, as it turned out, was stronger than death itself. In the settlement's archives, safely preserved alongside Shakespeare and Beethoven and the Constitution, Lydia had placed a simple handwritten note that captured their essential truth. We were librarians and mechanics and teachers and nurses and bakers and teenagers. We were ordinary people who chose to become extraordinary. We were the light that remains. The darkness had tested them. But the light had endured, growing brighter with each choice, each sacrifice, each moment they decided that tomorrow was worth fighting for.